reporting for RT from New York City.
And in light of these three young Muslims' tragic deaths, the question should be asked, why is media not talking about this as a case of terrorism? Consider how they have approached other cases.
It's important to call it what it is.
Yeah, I think you have to call it what it is, Megan, and I couldn't agree more with the last point that Congressman King made, which is that it's absolutely essential not only that we have our eyes open about what it is, but that we conduct the kind of intelligence-based, prevention-first counterterrorism that was our model from the time of the 9/11 attacks up until only very recently.
This is a very easy way to look at this. They are terror denialists. They deny terror at every place. So when Islamists kill Jews, they blame the butterfly effect. You know, it's like 9/11 was due to fog. This is not a White House. This is an outhouse. They're so full of crap.
So when do you call terror terror? Interviewing a family spokesperson in the case of these three Muslims, all shot in the head execution style, I asked Linda Sarsour if this case was a case of terrorism and whether it should be labeled as such. If the situation were reversed, would this be called an act of terrorism? Do you believe that in this case it should be called an act of terrorism?
It's absolutely an act of terrorism. Terrorism is a crime that has political or religious motivations behind it. This guy was an anti-theist. If you look at some of his social media posts, he was anti-religion, anti-religious people. These young women were wearing headscarves. They were identifiably Muslim. And we should be calling domestic terrorism regardless of who the perpetrator is or who the victims are. And in this case, this absolutely, to me, is a domestic terrorism case.
Well, joining me now to discuss is Zainab Chaudhry, a spokesperson for CAIR National. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's start here. I'll ask you the same question. Do you believe this was an act of terrorism? Should it be labeled as such?
I think it absolutely is. Like Linda said, I think it absolutely is an act of terrorism. The victims' families were terrorized. The community in North Carolina and Chapel Hill was terrorized. Muslims across the country have been terrorized. Anytime that anybody uses political motivations or ideologies to wage this kind of attack, I think we have to be able to call a spade, and that's exactly what it was.
Let's talk about the U.S. Code, and because obviously there's a legal definition here, and it defines terrorism this way. The term terrorism means premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. Under that technical definition, because clearly there's a difference between media calling something terrorism and a prosecutor charging someone with terrorism, under that definition, this was not a case of terrorism. On the other hand, you have this case of Eric Frayne. He's the man who was accused of opening fire on a Pennsylvania State Police barracks. He admitted to killing a trooper because he was dissatisfied with government and wanted to wake up people. In his case, he was charged with 2 counts of terrorism. Again, under this U.S. Code definition, he would also not be able to be charged with terrorism. Do you believe that there is a case here where the term terrorism is so subjective now that it no longer carries a clear legal definition?
That's absolutely a discussion that we have to have. How do we define the word terrorism? Who do we consider a terrorist? Mr. Hicks, the perpetrator in this particular case in Chapel Hill, he had a history of making anti-Muslim and anti-religion religious statements on social media. Two of his victims, Yasser and her sister Razan, they had told their parents and their families on multiple occasions that they felt threatened, they felt uncomfortable, they felt intimidated because they sensed that he harbored anti-Muslim sentiment. So I think the broader question that we should be asking and the broader debate that needs to be had is how do we define the word terrorism? Is it relegated only to specific people of a certain faith, or is it more encompassing of people of diverse religions?
And that's a great point. I guess part of where I look at it is in terms of archetypes. So we develop these archetypes, especially through media, because it really simplifies our job. You use a certain word and people have a connotation for it. But it seems like what has happened with media is that when they use the term terrorist, it no longer actually means committing an act of terrorism, as in the case of creating terror for someone or terrorizing them, rather to simply mean an act of violence by a Muslim on a non-Muslim. Is that what we're seeing in terms of the way that media is creating this archetype?
That's the sense that a lot of Muslims are getting, that there is a very clear disparity in how stories are reported when the perpetrator is Muslim versus when they're not Muslim. I think that there is a very clear bias in how a lot of the stories that we see are reported to mainstream, to the mainstream public, to the mainstream audience. We hear just recently there was a case in Washington, D.C. of a Muslim woman who wore a headscarf. She was physically and verbally assaulted by an individual, and she was told by authorities that they couldn't arrest him because he was somebody who was not considered to be who was considered to be mentally ill. An attack happened against a non-Muslim, and the individual who was a perpetrator of that particular attack, because of the fact he was deemed to be Muslim, that case is now being scrutinized as being a case of domestic terrorism. There are questions of whether, how, and where he was radicalized. This is a broader discussion, I think, that needs to be had on how do we frame this discussion on how we connotate these terms.
Especially when you begin to tack on the legal ramifications of being charged with terrorism. Obviously, it carries a much heavier penalty. So to have that charge put on you simply because of your faith, it would not just be unfair, but certainly not correct under rule of law. But let's also talk about these cases. We have these two different Muslim schools. There's one in Houston that was burned down, apparently. It was in Texas, suspected that arson is at play here. Also, this one in Rhode Island that we've been talking about. The school was vandalized. Degrading comments were spray painted on the building, including, by the way, phrases, you can see them there. Now, this is a hate crime. And so you actually have people who were vandalizing buildings here and calling their own crime a hate crime. And yet it seems like, and maybe I'm misreading it, but it seems like media is rarely covering these stories, and certainly not on a national level, with the exception of outlets like RT.
Even with this particular story in Chapel Hill, when this horrific tragedy that occurred in Chapel Hill, it took the media, mainstream media, national media, over 15 hours to report. This incident occurred at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday. The first story that was reported on national media was the next morning at around 8 a.m. and even that was after a flurry of activity on social media. And so you're absolutely right. It really requires a more broader discussion on how do we define the word terrorism and how it's being reported in the media.
Zainab Chaudhry, a spokeswoman for the Council on American Islamic Relations, thank you so much.
Thank you.